Hello, I'm Hazel Wright, and I am half of Menopause and Me with Sally Wotton from Crystal Learning. This is my taster for the second session of my Living Well with Menopause talk shop. And the subject today is hot flushes. So, hot flushes are one of the most common symptoms of menopause, and they're the one that when you mention the word menopause, most people will go, hot flushes. Nobody really seems to know what a hot flush is, but it's caused by a reduction in estrogen levels in the body of a woman at this time of life. If you have experienced a hot flush, then you will know exactly what it's like. To describe one is quite difficult, but it's like burning sensation that creeps up your whole body. So some people describe it as starting in the feet and sweeping up the entire body. Other people describe it as starting in the small of your back and then sweeping up to the top of your body. But it's an intense sort of burning feeling, and often cheeks will flush red with it, and you perspire. And a hot flush can go on for several minutes. Its kind of sister symptom, night sweats, are sort of fairly much the same, but the severity level of night sweats does vary. For some people, it's a bit like having a hot flush but at night. For other people, it can be so severe that I certainly know of women who have had to get up in the middle of the night and change their night clothes and their bed clothes because they're dripping wet. Of course, I should say really that it doesn't mean that every woman who goes through the menopause will experience a hot flush or a night sweat, but it does seem to be one of those most common symptoms that the majority of women do. So what are the effects of hot flushes? Well, first of all, they can, of course, be quite embarrassing. I think sometimes we can think that other people are noticing us having a hot flush far more than they actually are noticing us having it. But I think the very fact that we can tend to get quite flushed faces and we can sweat means that most people will be aware if they look at us that we are having a hot flush. So it is a bit embarrassing. It can be distracting. You know, if you are in the middle of doing something, if you're in the middle of a phone call, you're in the middle of speaking to somebody and a hot flush comes on, you can definitely kind of lose your focus, lose the thread of what you're doing because it becomes a bit all consuming for those few minutes. They can make you feel uncomfortable, particularly if you do perspire a lot. So you kind of start feeling a little bit wet and sticky. You can feel quite conspicuous. You're sort of sticking out like a sore thumb when it happens to you. In the workplace, it can cause issues in meetings because I think, obviously if you make a contribution in a meeting, then often all eyes turn on you while you're making that contribution. And if you are afraid that as soon as you start to speak, you're going to experience a hot flush, then it's the sort of thing that probably makes you withdraw a bit from the meetings. And so you don't engage as much. Or it could be that you begin to make your contribution and then a hot flush begins and you become distracted, you lose your focus, you lose the thread of what you're saying. Likewise with presentations, when we give a presentation, its very nature means that we're often stood there with everybody watching us. And if we then experience a hot flush, we've got nowhere to hide when we're stood at the front of the room. I once attended a presentation in Nottingham. It was actually done by ACAS, and it was a presentation on managing menopause in the workplace. And the first woman who stood up to speak started a hot flush instantly and then sort of said, "Oh, could somebody open a window, please?" And she said, "I feel comfortable about saying that in the present company." And of course she did, because we were all there thinking, yeah, we know that feeling. But if you're presenting to an audience that isn't, as we were, fairly full of women wanting to know more about menopause, then it can just feel a bit unprofessional and a bit disconcerting. So, yeah, it does cause issues in the workplace. And then, in terms of night sweats, if night sweats are a symptom for you, then of course they do disrupt sleep. That's the big thing. So, although we don't really understand what a hot flush is, we do know some of the triggers that cause them to happen. One of those triggers is actually eating spicy foods. So just something to be a bit aware of. Caffeine can trigger a hot flush. So tea, coffee, pretty much really any hot drinks will trigger a hot flush. Alcohol can trigger. So particularly red wine. So if, like me, your tipple happens to be red wine, it's bad news. Smoking. Wearing thick clothing, that can trigger a hot flush, because an accelerated heat will trigger a hot flush. So that might be accelerated heat because you are wearing thick clothing, or it could be accelerated heat in the environment. So it could be you're in a hot room, you're in hot sunshine, or even that you're unwell and you're running a temperature yourself, so your body is already hot, and all of that increased heat can trigger a hot flush. And feeling stressed or anxious is a key trigger for triggering a hot flush, hence why they can become an issue when you are suddenly the focus in a meeting or heading up a presentation. I used to find in the workplace that for some reason, if I was on a very difficult phone call, that would absolutely trigger a hot flush for me. And I would put the phone down at the end of the phone call and just be dripping. And I used to be very, very grateful that I was actually on a phone call and not on a video link. So I'm going to leave you with 4 things to consider to just kind of try to help reduce hot flushes. So the first one is keep whatever room you're in cool and use a fan. So that might be a desk fan or a standing fan, or even one of those pretty little like Spanish fans that you can fold up and put in your handbag. It's actually a pretty sure sign of being in a room with women in the menopause if they suddenly start groping in their handbag for one of those fans or a piece of paper to fan themselves with when the hot flushes occur. Wear layers of clothing, yep, so that you can then obviously remove a layer when a hot flush occurs. If you wear, for example, a jumper over the top of underwear and then you experience a hot flush, you've got nowhere to go in removing layers, or certainly not if you're in the middle of a meeting or something. So think about layers, and light cotton or silk are best for those layers. And likewise, it's probably worth thinking about having layers on the bed, so that instead of having, as most of us do, just a quilt, which means that the quilt then has to go off during a night sweat, and then very quickly, as the night sweat passes and your skin cools down, you'll become very cold, and then the quilt has to go back on. So it spends the entire night going on and off. If you've got layers of sheets, then you can do the same with those layers as you would with layers of clothing. Having a shower in lukewarm water helps with hot flushes, and so does sipping cold or iced drinks, because as I mentioned earlier, hot drinks and drinks with caffeine are known triggers for hot flushes. So I hope that has helped a bit. Um, Next week, the subject is going to be sleep, which is often a key issue for women going through the menopause. Sometimes because they are losing sleep with night sweats, but also because the menopause does affect our sleep patterns. So we'll be looking at that more next week. In the meantime, if you would like to engage with this post, I would really welcome that. And if you feel willing to share your experiences of hot flushes and anything that you might have tried that could work for other women, I'm sure everyone will be very happy to hear those tips. Thank you very much for listening. Bye bye.